everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. My name is Sergei Sputnikov, and back in 1971, I was born in the USSR. In today's video, I want to share my recollections of the last money reform in the Soviet Union, which occurred in January of 1991, and it was so-called Reforma Pavlova, Pavlov reform. During 69 years of existence of the Soviet Union, there were quite a few money reforms, 4 major ones and several smaller-scale reforms. There were 3 money reforms that occurred right away after creation of the Soviet Union in 1922, so that's the money reforms of 1922, 1923, and 1924. And it looks like by 1924, the Soviet government realized that inflation doesn't care if money being printed by socialist government or capitalist government. Inflation just happens. So in 1924, they introduced a gold-backed currency called Zolotoy Chervonets, golden chervonets, and that stabilized currency, and that was the beginning of new economic policy under Lenin. Comrade Stalin had 2 money reforms. One occurred in 1937 and one in 1947. I'm planning to make separate videos on those topics, but there were some cool-looking currencies that was introduced in 1937. Then there were some bizarre currencies introduced in 1938. That's the very first time when image of Lenin showed up on the Soviet money, but it wasn't called ruble, it was called chervonets. And apparently each chervonets was equal to 10 rubles. So that's, I think, added confusion. And then it was a Khrushchev money reform of 1961, and that one was mostly denomination. So they exchanged Stalin-era 1947 currency to new 1961 currency, and rate was 10 old rubles for 1 new ruble, and also changed prices, which they rose slightly under the disguise of denomination. And 1961 currency, that's the money I grew up with. If you remember, I was born in 1971, and I already have a separate playlist when I talk a little bit about Soviet-era money, which is 1961 money, and how much stuff we could purchase with 1 kopeck, 2 kopecks, and so on. Link will be below in the comment section. And the last reform happened in January of 1991, so pretty much about 11 months before the end of the Soviet Union. It was introduced by, at that time, Minister of Finances, Pavlov, and that's how the reform got the name, Pavlov money reform, but technically it should be called Gorbachev reform, since nothing would happen in the Soviet Union without Gorbachev's approval. But before we start talking about Pavlov's money reform, I would like to pause for a second and look back and talk about my family's achievements. So my parents got married in 1970. So let's take a look what they managed to achieve in 21 years of joint marriage. Both were working full-time, both were labor union members, and let's see what they managed to achieve by January of 1991. So my late father, Nikolai, worked all his life as a spray painter. He started working at Antonov Aircraft Factory, and I believe he worked there to about like 1983. And then he got a different job still as a spray painter, but he was just painting little parts and Ural military trucks. And the only reason he changed jobs is because it was too far to travel to aircraft factory after we moved. But the pay was the same, about 180 to 200 rubles per month. My mother, Elena, she was more aggressive in changing jobs, mostly because she was chasing better housing options. Once again, in the Soviet Union, you had to be on the waiting list to get an apartment. So she changed probably 4 jobs in that 20 years. And her average salary was about 130 rubles in 1980s. And what was she doing for most of her part? She was making technical drawings for engineers. So there's probably some official term for that, but pretty much engineer wants to design some part. He tells my mom dimensions, what it's going to look like, and she will put it on the paper. She'll make a technical drawing. In Russian, it's called chertezhnitsa. So my parents' combined salary was about 4,000 rubles a year. That's including some bonuses. Periodically, Soviet workers were getting so-called performance bonuses and quite often so-called 13th salary, so annual bonus, or 13th зарплата. So you got 12 monthly salaries plus a bonus 13th salary. According to my mother, our family managed to save 6,000 rubles, which we kept at the state savings bank. Сберегательный банк or Sberbank, that was the only place that Soviet people could keep their earnings, keep their savings, and receive interest. And I already have a video on this topic, so if you're interested in the topic of the Soviet savings bank, a link will be below in the comment section. And I just want to remind everyone that Soviet citizens had no options of investing their money in any ventures, any stocks. The only way you could gain interest would be to put in your money in a state savings bank, and I believe the highest rate you could get was 4% a year. If you follow my channel, you may remember that I mentioned many times how much fun was to live in the Soviet Union during Perestroika time. I mean, I remember some Brezhnev-era, Andropov-era. Chernenko was like a quick glimpse, but then Perestroika was just a lot of fun, mostly because of Glasnost, of course, the policy of openness. But there were some warning signals about economy, that something is terribly wrong with the Soviet economy. And then, of course, that's all ended up with the Pavlov reform in January of 1991. While I strongly believe that the Soviet Union was a sick puppy way before Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party, but some of his reforms maybe made the things worse. For example, in May of 1988, the Soviet government allowed its citizens to join and create so-called cooperatives, so small private enterprises, and those cooperatives were allowed to hire people, so they could use hired labor, which is a huge step back for the whole concept of socialism. No private enterprise, no private ownership of means of production, right? So we were going back to original new economic policy NEP of 1920s, so that was NEP 2.0. Probably we'll need to make a separate video on this topic of this interesting dual currency system in the Soviet Union. So we had normal cash money, right, and that's when factories paid workers with cash, people purchased things with cash, and then Soviet enterprises, factories, and so on were trading between each other using so-called безналичный ruble, so like cashless ruble or virtual ruble. So we had two circles of cash flow. One was cash among the citizens and a virtual cash among the Soviet enterprises. And now with all these new cooperative private enterprises, they were in need of cash as well as virtual cash. So Soviet government had to create additional mechanism of making virtual cash into real cash, and only some specific companies were allowed to do it, and those guys got filthy rich because they started offering their services of cashing virtual ruble to regular Soviet enterprises. So now basically the whole financial systems got flooded with this additional cash. And sometime in 1990, the Soviet government became concerned with all that additional cash sloshing around the financial system, and especially a lot of that cash settled in the Soviet savings bank, Sberbank, since it was the only place you could save money. So they knew how much additional cash Soviet citizens had, and they decided to start this money reform that will allow government to confiscate billions of rubles of illegal gains, and that was the whole idea behind the Pavlov money reform. And I actually remember some of these bizarre signs that something was seriously wrong in the Soviet economy. So in 1990, I was a 19-year-old college student, and we started seeing these weird occurrences when suddenly sugar would disappear and be no sugar available to buy in the capital of Ukraine for a month, or maybe even salt or some other items. So it was just like this weird disappearance of specific goods. So that was kind of weird. Then government started raising prices, which usually was kind of unheard of. Like suddenly announced this category of prices going up. Not much, but up. Then prices go up on something else, so that was also kind of unsettling. But I believe I became really concerned that one day I noticed this huge line of people standing in the front of the jewelry store. So we had a specialized stores called Ювелирный magazine, and that's the only place you could buy goods made from precious metals, mostly gold and silver, so rings, earrings, and stuff like that. So there was a huge line of people. So people who kind of maybe got idea that government was planning something were in rush to exchange their rubles for precious metals. So that's when I decided to talk to my parents. So one evening I asked my parents to come to my room, and I had a little spiel with them. I was like, I'm really concerned about what's going on in our country, and I'm afraid there's something may happen with our savings, your savings, and at that time they had 6,000 rubles in savings, as I mentioned earlier. And I offered them, like, how about you guys take the money out of Sberbank? And I know a guy who sells American dollars, and the rate of exchange was 30 rubles per dollar. So we can turn your 6,000 rubles into $200. And at that time, that was a huge amount of money for Soviet citizens. And this way, we'll preserve your savings. And guess what my mother said? Like, that stuck forever in my mind. She told me, "Государство нас не обманет." The state won't cheat us. And that, she told me, like, ironclad statement, and she walked out of the room. And that's how we lost our money. And before we start talking about actual Pavlov's reform, we need to discuss Soviet cash. So we had, paper money and coins, and I already made several videos on the topic how much stuff you could buy with even 1 kopeck, 2 kopecks. But the paper currency was 1 ruble, 3 rubles, 5 rubles, 10 rubles, 25, 50, and 100. With the average salary in the 80s was between 150 and 200 rubles, my family rarely saw 50 ruble or 100. Like 100, like, it was not, I don't think I ever even touched that piece of paper during my Soviet days. The most popular, like large bills were pretty much 10 and 25 rubles. But when people started making serious money in their private enterprises, cooperativы, that's the most bills that they used were 50 ruble and 100 ruble bills. And that was the idea behind the Pavlov's reform. So Pavlov's money reform was a surprise confiscation type of money reforms. So there is a chronicle for you. On January 10th, 1991, Pavlov, who was the Minister of Finances in the Soviet Union, announced that there's no preparations for any type of a money reform. 12 days later, on January 22nd, there was a law about exchanging large nomination bills, so 50 ruble bills and 100 ruble bills had to be exchanged for a new type. So in 3 days, Soviet citizens had to exchange all the large ruble bills. Limit was 1,000 rubles per person. So if you have on hand more than 1,000 rubles, kiss those rubles goodbye. And of course, if you had them in savings accounts, it would be okay. But simultaneously, Soviet government introduced limit how much money you can take out of your savings account. It was capped at 500 rubles. So that created huge panic. There was people line up next to Sberkasse trying to remove money from savings account. There were people trying to figure out, if they had 10,000 rubles stashed somewhere in cash, how to save that money. So there was huge panic, a lot of drama. And as the end result, Soviet government managed to get rid of no more than 10% of that extra cash. People still found a way to save their savings, and they had them in cash. So there was huge fiasco in part of the Soviet government. Some people ran to the train stations and they were buying the most expensive train tickets just to get rid of the old large bills, because they had 3 days, right, to get rid of them. And then they waited for next week and they took train tickets back and returned them and got their money back. So this way they got rid of old bills and they got new bills. So that was a smart way of doing things, using train or plane tickets. And of course, many people knew about this reform way in advance and they prepared accordingly. So people actually had a lot of cash and they knew way in advance, because it's impossible to design new currency, print new currency, distribute the currency all over the country, get all those preparations done and keep it under total control. So people told friends, told relatives, and people who had a lot of cash, they prepared in advance. They may purchase used cars, bought a lot of gold or whatever. When I talked to my brother's father-in-law, he basically smiled, and he was like a director of a local distillery in the Chernigiv region. And he didn't admit, but kind of smiled like, yeah, we knew about it. So being a director of distillery, he basically made the distillery to sell him a house that he was allowed to live. So distillery built a house for its director. So if director retires, he moves out and new director moves in. Well, at that time, he was the director and he just kind of made the paperwork that allowed him to privatize that house. So that's a really nice house, like a stick-built home, unusual for Ukraine, with indoor plumbing, indoor heating, and he basically privatized that. So he saved his cash by putting it into the home. So that was a smart way of doing it. But of course, and that's because he was a director of distillery and a Communist Party member. And after Pavlov's reform of January 1991, things went downhill in the Soviet Union. Prices skyrocketed in March, and then the government kind of somewhat unfroze people's savings. There were limits again how much money you can remove. At any rate, my parents never took money out of a savings account. Then of course Soviet Union disappeared in December of 1991. Then it was Ukraine. Then it was all this mess with the new currencies. Rubles were canceled. Temporary Ukrainian currency was introduced. Similar mess was going on all over the former Soviet Union. Then hyperinflation in every former Soviet republic. So in the end, when my mother finally was able to remove money from savings account, that 6,000 rubles, all the money that my parents saved for 20 years, was enough to buy 2 loaves of bread. And when I started asking around, I discovered that my family actually didn't lose a lot of money, although still 6,000 rubles was the entire lifetime savings of my family. My childhood friend Dima, his mother lost 25,000 rubles, and many other people I knew, losses were between 10 and 15,000 rubles. And the total amount of money that Soviet citizens lost, the money that were locked in the Sberbank, Soviet savings bank, was about 315 billion rubles. A lot of money. It just basically vanished because of the hyperinflation. And it was kind of bittersweet when I talked to my mother about the events of 1991 and collapse of the Soviet Union. She actually also remembered that I tried to convince them to withdraw our savings and turn to American dollars. And she said, yeah, you are right. I made a big mistake that I didn't listen to you, but you were only 19. What did you know? And now, since I'm older and a little bit smarter, I'm thinking the best way to preserve my family wealth would be not spending 6,000 rubles on American dollars, which still would be better than just letting it being wasted in the Soviet state bank. I would take 6,000 rubles and go to a local collector's market, which we had in Kiev, and I should be buying silver coins, gold coins, World War II awards, any old documents and stuff like that. Back then it was really cheap, and they not just preserved in value, they actually increased in price quite a bit. So that would be probably the way to go, to spend 6,000 rubles on gold and silver coins and other collectibles. And they'll be probably worth quite a bit of money now. Okay, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this quick and dirty review of 1991 Pavlov reform in the Soviet Union. And if you did, please don't forget to like this video. And remember, I always enjoy your comments and questions, and especially a super thanks. I like to be bribed. And we'll talk to you soon. До побачення. Goodbye.